Welcome to War Archives Black. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed and leave a like to stay inside the operation.
The Army Major Leader That Never Quits: How the Army Creates Strong Humans. In the winter of 1953, deep within the snow-covered hills of Fort Benning, Georgia, a young recruit stood at attention for 18 hours straight. His legs trembled beneath him, muscles spasming in waves that traveled from his calves to his thighs, each fiber screaming for relief that would not come. His vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in from the periphery like ink spreading through water. Sweat had long since soaked through his uniform despite the freezing temperature, and his breath came in shallow, controlled gasps that he forced to remain silent. But he did not fall. He could not fall. Behind him, watching from a shadowed observation room with a one-way mirror that reflected nothing but his own suffering, 3 men in uniform took notes in silence, their pens scratching against paper with mechanical precision. They were not documenting his physical endurance, not measuring the limits of his body or the strength of his muscles. They were measuring something far more valuable, something the Army had been perfecting for decades through trial and error, through observation of prisoners and analysis of breaking points, the complete erasure of the word quit from the human vocabulary. This was not training in any traditional sense. This was transformation, systematic and irreversible. And the man who designed it, a decorated major with a background in behavioral psychology and prisoner of war interrogation techniques, understood one fundamental truth about the human mind that others had missed. Breaking it down was easy, any drill sergeant could accomplish that with enough volume and cruelty, but rebuilding it into something unbreakable required precision, repetition, and the careful application of controlled suffering administered in doses calibrated to destroy and reconstruct simultaneously. His name has been erased from most official records, scrubbed from commendations and removed from unit histories, referenced only in declassified fragments that survived bureaucratic purges as Major Elias Drummond, though some veterans who passed through his program and lived to speak of it, often in whispers and only to each other, called him the architect. He never raised his voice, never struck a recruit with his hands, never threatened punishment in the traditional military sense of extra duty or physical correction. Instead, he orchestrated environments where quitting became psychologically impossible, not because men were brave or patriotic or driven by some noble cause, but because their minds had been conditioned through specific neurological pathways to perceive surrender as a form of death worse than any physical pain they could endure. Drummond's methods were born from observation of enemy interrogation techniques, refined through his own experiences as a prisoner during the final months of World War II, where he witnessed men break in ways that fascinated him more than they horrified him, and perfected in the controlled laboratories of military training facilities where young men arrived as individuals with dreams and fears and identities, and left as instruments of a singular will that was no longer entirely their own. The Army had always known how to make soldiers, that was simple conditioning, but Drummond showed them how to make machines that still believed they were human, that carried the illusion of choice while operating under programming so deep it felt like instinct. The philosophy began with a question that haunted military strategists and psychologists after the Korean War, a question that appeared in classified briefings and kept generals awake at night. Why did some American prisoners break under interrogation while others endured unspeakable torture, starvation, isolation, and psychological torment without yielding a single piece of useful intelligence? The answer, Drummond discovered through months of interviews with repatriated POWs and analysis of enemy interrogation records captured during the conflict, was not rooted in physical toughness or patriotic fervor or religious conviction. It was in the architecture of identity itself, in the way a man understood who he was at the most fundamental level. Men who broke did so because they still believed they had a choice, because somewhere in their minds remained the idea that they could decide when enough was enough, that they maintained sovereignty over their own surrender. Men who endured had undergone a psychological recalibration so deep, often through years of hardship before capture, that the concept of choice had been replaced with inevitability, with a sense that endurance was not a decision but a state of being. Drummond realized that if this transformation could be replicated artificially, controlled through environmental manipulation and psychological technique, and systematically applied during the training process rather than waiting for circumstance to create it randomly, the Army could produce soldiers who functioned beyond the limits of normal human will, who operated in spaces where other men collapsed. Not through inspiration or nationalism or appeals to duty, but through the methodical destruction and reconstruction of the self at the neurological level. His program began quietly in 1952, embedded within the Ranger training pipeline at Fort Benning, disguised as advanced leadership conditioning for officers destined for special operations commands. Recruits who entered this phase believed they were being prepared for command positions in elite units, trained to lead men under fire, to make life and death decisions in chaos and ambiguity. They did not know they were test subjects in a long-term study of psychological resilience engineering, participants in an experiment that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The selection process was subtle, designed to avoid raising suspicion or resistance. Officers conducting evaluations looked for men who were ambitious and intelligent, who had already demonstrated capability under standard training conditions, men who possessed something to lose. Drummond understood from his research that you could not reshape a man who had nothing, who arrived already broken or empty. You needed raw material with structure, with identity and pride and sense of self, and then you carefully, methodically dismantled it piece by piece while the subject watched and participated in his own dissolution. The first phase was called integration, though the term was deliberately misleading, designed to sound positive and team-oriented when briefed to commanders who might question the methodology. It was not about bringing men together into cohesive units or building camaraderie and trust. It was about isolating them within a collective, creating a psychological space where individual identity dissolved into group function while simultaneously ensuring that the group itself could never truly cohere into something that might resist the program. Recruits were formed into small teams, 5 to 7 men carefully selected to have complementary weaknesses, and given a series of impossible tasks that appeared achievable on paper but were designed with hidden variables that guaranteed failure. The tasks themselves were secondary, mere vehicles for the actual conditioning. What mattered was that failure was inevitable, mathematically certain, and every failure was framed not as a problem with the task but as a leadership deficiency, a collective inability to transcend normal human limitation through willpower and mental evolution. If a team could not complete a 20-mile forced march in 3 hours while carrying logs that weighed more than any reasonable load calculation would permit, pushing through terrain that included swamps and hills and obstacles deliberately placed to slow progress, the fault was not acknowledged to be in the physics of the task or the biological limits of human performance. The fault, instructors explained in calm, disappointed tones, was in their collective failure to transcend limitation through superior mental conditioning. Drummond never told them the tasks were impossible, never admitted that success was not an option. He simply observed from his position in the observation room, took detailed notes in leather-bound journals that were later classified, and reminded them in periodic addresses that somewhere, in some unit that they were never allowed to verify, someone had succeeded at exactly this challenge. This planted the seed of a belief that would grow throughout the program like a virus replicating through neural tissue. Failure was not circumstantial or situational, it was personal and internal, and it could be overcome through mental evolution if only they pushed hard enough, suffered long enough, surrendered enough of what made them weak. Sleep was carefully controlled throughout this phase, not through simple deprivation in the way basic training sometimes employed, but through calculated disruption designed to attack circadian rhythm and neurological recovery. Men slept in cycles that never aligned with natural biological patterns, woken at irregular intervals that prevented REM sleep from completing its restorative functions. They were pulled from bunks at midnight for inspections where every item was found deficient. They were roused at 3 in the morning for emergency drills that tested nothing but their ability to function while cognitively impaired. They were relocated to new barracks at dawn just as sleep finally came, forced to rebuild their sleeping areas according to specifications that changed each time. The goal was not exhaustion in the traditional sense, though that was a side effect. The goal was disorientation, the systematic destruction of the body's ability to regulate itself, to predict rest, to maintain the biological rhythms that allowed for psychological stability. When the mind cannot predict rest, when it operates in a perpetual state of sleep-deprived hyper-awareness, it begins to burn through cognitive reserves at an accelerated rate, consuming the glucose and neurotransmitters that allow for critical thinking and resistance. Psychological defenses, the internal mechanisms that allow a person to say this is wrong or I should not do this, begin to lower like drawbridges collapsing. In this state, men became more receptive to instruction not through choice but through neurological vulnerability. They were more willing to accept new frameworks of thinking, new definitions of what was possible or impossible, because their ability to critically resist had been chemically and neurologically compromised. Drummond called this the softening phase in his notes, the period where identity became malleable like clay that had been soaked and kneaded, ready to be reshaped into something new. During this time, instructors employed a technique Drummond had adapted from Soviet psychological research papers he had obtained through intelligence channels, a method that appeared in translated documents from NKVD training facilities: reflective humiliation. When a recruit failed at a task and failure was constant, he was not punished with physical exercise or verbal abuse. Instead, he was asked to explain in front of his team while they stood at attention and listened why he had failed. He was encouraged to be honest, vulnerable, to admit weakness and examine his deficiencies. And when he did, when he opened himself and spoke truthfully about his limitations and fears, the instructor would nod slowly, thank him for his honesty with what seemed like genuine appreciation, and then assign the exact same task again without modification. This cycle repeated endlessly, day after day, until the recruit stopped explaining his failures and simply complied with the next iteration. The message was clear though never explicitly stated. Introspection was permitted, even encouraged, but conclusion was not allowed. Your weakness is acknowledged and documented, now overcome it through force of will. Over weeks of this treatment, men stopped analyzing their failures and started simply enduring whatever came next. Thought became an obstacle to function. Action became identity. The second phase was known internally as the separation, and it was here that Drummond's program diverged most sharply and disturbingly from traditional military training methodologies. Recruits were removed from their teams without warning or explanation, often during the night while they slept, shaken awake by instructors who said nothing, and placed in solitary training environments that felt more like confinement than education. They were told this was a test of individual capability, that their performance during this phase would determine whether they returned to their unit or were reassigned to regular Army duties, which by this point felt like exile or failure. In truth, every man would eventually return, but this was isolation conditioning, the systematic destruction of the group identity that had been carefully constructed during integration. Each man was given tasks that objectively required coordination, communication, and teamwork to complete, problems designed for multiple people to solve together. But he was alone, locked in a training compound with high fences and no contact with other recruits. He was told to complete the tasks anyway, told that other men had succeeded in this exact situation through superior mental conditioning and creative problem solving. When he inevitably failed, unable to carry objects that required 4 people or communicate with team members who did not exist, he was not berated or punished. He was simply told to try again tomorrow, to think about what he could do differently, to evolve beyond his current limitations. And again the next day. And again. The tasks never changed, the parameters never shifted, and success never came no matter how creative or determined the attempt. But the effort was continuous, the expectation unwavering. This created a profound psychological fracture, a split in the recruit's sense of self that Drummond had carefully engineered. The identity that had been slowly absorbed into the team during integration, the sense of self that had become collective and diffuse, was now stripped away suddenly and completely. He could not succeed as an individual, that had been proven through repeated failure. But he no longer had access to the collective that had become his only source of competence and meaning. In this void, this space between identities where nothing stable existed, something new took root like fungus growing in darkness. Drummond called it the command identity in his research notes, describing it as a mental construct where the individual no longer perceived himself as a person making choices based on internal drives and desires, but as a function executing orders that came from somewhere beyond the self. The boundary between self and role dissolved like sugar and water, impossible to separate once mixed. Men stopped asking why they were performing tasks that made no sense. They stopped seeking logical explanations for commands that seemed arbitrary or cruel. Instead, they started asking only how, searching for any method to achieve whatever was demanded. And when no answer came, when the how remained elusive because the task was impossible, they simply acted anyway, performing the motions with mechanical precision even though the outcome never changed. The mind, desperate for structure and meaning in an environment deliberately designed to provide neither, built its own framework from the only materials available: obedience as existence. Following orders became the only form of identity that remained stable, the only constant in an environment of engineered chaos. Drummond observed this transformation through one-way mirrors and detailed it in reports that were classified upon completion. He noted that men began to refer to themselves in the third person during this phase, speaking about their bodies and actions as if observing from outside. The recruit attempted to lift the log, the recruit secured the perimeter, the recruit maintained position. The self had been successfully separated from action. After weeks in isolation, anywhere from 3 to 7 depending on how quickly the transformation completed, recruits were returned to their teams without explanation or ceremony. They were simply moved during the night back to their original units and training resumed as if nothing had occurred. But they were not the same men who had been taken. They no longer sought camaraderie or validation from their peers. They did not share stories or form bonds or engage in the normal social behaviors that characterized military units. They functioned alongside their teammates, efficient and coordinated and silent, but there was no warmth in the function, no humanity in the efficiency. Drummond observed that men who had undergone the separation began to treat their own bodies as equipment, mechanical systems requiring maintenance but not comfort or mercy. They regulated pain with detachment, reporting injuries in flat, clinical language devoid of distress. Ankle is compromised, vision is impaired, hand is non-functional. They did not complain, did not seek sympathy, did not express frustration or fear. They did not question orders even when those orders seemed to contradict previous instructions or common sense. When asked how they felt during medical evaluations or psychological screenings that were conducted to monitor the program's effects, they often paused for long moments, as if the question itself was foreign or incomprehensible, and then responded with status updates rather than emotions. Operational, functional, ready for deployment. This was the goal Drummond had been working toward, the endpoint he had designed into every phase. Emotion was interference, static in the signal that degraded performance and allowed for hesitation. Clarity was compliance, and compliance was the only state that mattered. A soldier who could feel could also doubt, and doubt was the seed of failure. The relief they felt was not from the absence of suffering, though that was how they experienced it consciously. The relief came from the validation of their transformation, from external confirmation that their suffering had meaning and purpose and had produced something valuable. They had survived, and survival was now their entire identity, the only story they could tell about themselves. Drummond understood from his psychological research that men who believed they had earned their strength through suffering would defend that identity more fiercely than any oath or ideology or national allegiance. They would never quit because quitting would mean their suffering had been meaningless, and the human mind will endure almost anything, will accept almost any horror, to avoid the conclusion that its pain served no purpose. The meaning they had constructed from their suffering was more precious than life itself because it was all they had left. Graduates of Drummond's program were deployed across various special operations units throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, and their performance in the field was extraordinary by every measurable metric. They completed missions that other soldiers refused to attempt, operations that regular units had abandoned as too dangerous or impossible. They endured injuries that should have been incapacitating, fractures and lacerations and concussions that would have sent normal soldiers to medical evacuation, and continued to function at near-peak efficiency. They did not break under interrogation when captured, not because they were braver than other prisoners, but because the psychological architecture that allowed for breaking had been systematically removed during their training. In after-action reports that accumulated in classified files, commanding officers noted an unusual pattern that appeared consistently. These men rarely celebrated victories or mourned losses. They did not display emotion when missions succeeded or failed. They simply moved to the next objective with mechanical efficiency, ready for whatever came next. Some officers described them as the best soldiers they had ever commanded, praising their reliability and unshakable resolve. Others described them as unsettling, noting that something essential seemed to be missing, though they could not articulate exactly what. But there were costs, terrible costs that would not become apparent for years, hidden beneath the success metrics and mission completion rates. In the late 1960s, as veterans of Drummond's program began transitioning to civilian life after their service obligations ended, patterns began to emerge in VA hospitals and counseling centers. Many could not maintain relationships with spouses or children, could not connect emotionally with the people they had fought to protect. They described feeling disconnected from their families, as if observing their own lives from a distance through glass, present physically but absent in every way that mattered. Their wives reported that their husbands seemed hollow, that they performed the actions of family life without any visible joy or sorrow, that they existed rather than lived. They struggled with jobs that required independent decision-making, not because they lacked intelligence or skill, but because they had been conditioned to function within command structures that no longer existed, waiting for orders that would never come. Some sought purpose in law enforcement or private security, environments that provided clear hierarchies and defined objectives. Others drifted through years of unemployment, unable to reconcile the identity they had built through suffering with a world that had no use for it and did not understand what had been done to them. A significant number took their own lives in the decades following their service, a statistical anomaly that appeared in mortality studies but was never publicly connected to the program. They did not die in moments of despair or crisis or emotional breakdown. They died with the same calm efficiency they had once applied to missions, planning their deaths with tactical precision and executing them without hesitation or apparent regret. They left no notes, no explanations, no emotional appeals. They simply executed a final objective that made sense only within the framework they had been given. The mission is complete, the function has concluded, the system may now shut down. In the cold mathematics of their transformed minds, it was logical. Drummond's program had succeeded completely. They had become exactly what he had designed them to be, and there was no mechanism left within them to question whether that was a victory or a tragedy. The Army quietly distanced itself from Drummond's methods in the early 1970s, not because they were ineffective or cruel or ethically indefensible, but because they were too effective. The men produced by the program were ideal soldiers but catastrophically poor citizens. They could not reintegrate into society, could not adapt to environments that lacked clear command structure and defined objectives. They had been transformed so completely, so irreversibly, that the transformation could not be undone even when it was no longer needed. Drummond himself was reassigned to administrative duties reviewing training protocols, a position designed to remove him from direct involvement with soldiers. He retired quietly in 1974 with full honors and a pension. He gave no interviews to military historians, published no memoirs or analyses of his work, attended no reunions or veterans events. He lived alone in a small house in Virginia and died in 1989 of a massive stroke, his body discovered 3 days later by a neighbor who noticed the mail piling up. His files were immediately classified at the highest levels, his methods buried under layers of bureaucratic euphemism and national security justifications. But his legacy persisted, woven into the fabric of military training in ways that became invisible precisely because they were so pervasive. Elements of his program, stripped of their most extreme and legally questionable components, were integrated into Ranger School, SEER training for pilots and special operators, and other elite military pipelines where men were prepared for the worst humanity could inflict. The language changed to make it acceptable. The techniques were softened to reduce the visible damage. But the core philosophy remained intact. The human will is not innate or naturally occurring, it is constructed through experience, and with the right tools applied at the right developmental moments, it can be rebuilt into something that does not recognize limitation or surrender. The modern military does not speak of breaking men anymore, not in official documents or public addresses. It speaks of forging resilience, cultivating mental toughness, building unbreakable warriors who can operate in any environment and overcome any obstacle. The words are different, carefully chosen to sound noble and aspirational, but the process underneath remains the same. Controlled suffering administered in calibrated doses. Identity dissolution achieved through isolation and impossible demands. Reconstruction through repetition until new patterns become permanent. The humanity is extracted, and something else is installed in the space it occupied. What Drummond understood, and what the Army has never publicly acknowledged in any official capacity, is that strength is not something you discover within yourself through challenge and adversity. It is something that is installed, carefully and deliberately, through the systematic removal of everything that allows you to be weak. The soldiers we celebrate, the ones who never quit regardless of circumstances, who endure the unendurable without complaint, who sacrifice everything including their own humanity without hesitation, they are not born with some special quality or gift. They are made through processes that would horrify us if we understood them completely. And the process of making them is not inspirational or uplifting or noble. It is clinical, methodical, cold. It is the systematic engineering of human will, and once it is complete, the person who entered the program no longer exists in any meaningful sense. What remains is a function highly efficient and perfectly obedient, capable of extraordinary things that regular humans cannot achieve, but no longer entirely human in the ways that matter. In the years since Drummond's retirement and death, elements of his philosophy have appeared in unexpected places, metastasizing beyond military applications. Corporate training seminars for executives teach watered-down versions of his techniques, rebranded as leadership development and mental toughness training. Motivational programs for athletes use similar frameworks of controlled suffering and identity reconstruction, pushing people beyond their perceived limits through psychological manipulation disguised as coaching. Educational reform models propose similar methods for building resilience in students, creating artificial adversity to prepare them for real challenges. The language is always sanitized, the brutality removed or hidden behind therapeutic terminology. But the core idea persists and spreads. That quitting is a choice rather than a biological necessity, that limitation is a mindset rather than a physical reality, that with enough pressure and the right conditioning, anyone can be transformed into something more capable, more efficient, more productive. We celebrate this ideology. We call it resilience. We call it mental toughness and grit and determination. We call it growth and self-improvement and reaching your potential. But we do not ask what is lost in the process of building these qualities. We do not ask what happens to the part of the person that wanted to quit, that recognized pain as a signal that something was wrong, that understood that surrender is sometimes the only rational response to impossible circumstances. We do not ask because we do not want to know the answer. It is easier to believe that strength is inherently noble, that endurance is virtue, that the men who never quit are heroes whose example we should follow and whose methods we should emulate. And perhaps they are heroes in some sense, though not in the way we imagine. They are certainly survivors. But they are also constructs, carefully built by systems that understood how to dismantle the mechanisms of self-preservation that evolution installed over millions of years, and replace them with something that looks like courage but functions like programming. The young man who stood at attention for 18 hours in the winter of 1953, whose legs trembled and vision blurred but who did not fall, was not displaying some innate quality of character. He was demonstrating the effectiveness of techniques designed to make falling psychologically impossible. His strength was real, his endurance measurable. But it was not his own. It had been installed in him through months of careful psychological manipulation, and the price he paid for that strength was everything that made him who he was before the process began. The recruits who entered Fort Benning in that winter and in the winters that followed believed they were volunteering for an opportunity, a chance to prove themselves and serve at the highest level. They believed they would become leaders, that they would learn to inspire men and make difficult decisions and embody the values they had been taught to admire since childhood. They did not know they were entering a process that would erase the person they had been and replace it with something engineered for a single purpose. And when they emerged months later, silent and efficient and unbreakable, they believed they had discovered their true selves, had found reserves of strength they never knew existed. They had not discovered anything. They had been carefully, methodically, and irreversibly rebuilt. The man who designed the process understood this completely. He documented it in reports that were never meant to be read by the public, in journals that were classified immediately upon his death. And in one of those reports, buried in a classified archive that was partially declassified in 2003 with heavy redactions, Major Elias Drummond wrote a single sentence that summarized his entire philosophy and revealed the truth beneath all the inspiring stories of military valor. The strongest human is not the one who refuses to break under pressure, but the one who no longer remembers he ever had the capacity to break. That sentence, more than any medal or commendation or official recognition, is his legacy. It is the quiet truth beneath every story of heroism we tell ourselves, every tale of soldiers who endured the impossible and came home carrying secrets, every narrative of men who never quit no matter what hell they faced. They did not choose strength through some noble decision or moral conviction. Strength was chosen for them by systems operating above their level of awareness. And once the process was complete, once the transformation was finalized, the choice was gone forever. What remained was function without questioning. What remained was obedience without resistance. What remained was a human being who had been perfected into something that could no longer recognize its own suffering because the part of the mind that recognized suffering had been systematically destroyed and replaced with mechanisms that interpreted pain as information rather than experience. And the Army, like every institution throughout history that has ever sought to control the human mind and bend it to purposes beyond individual will, understood that this was not a flaw in the design or an unfortunate side effect to be minimized. It was the entire point. It was always the entire point. If you've listened this far, you already know too much. The archives remember what we try to forget. Subscribe to War Archives Black and remember, silence is control. Join us again for the next archive, if you're ready to see what else was hidden.